Success in investing does not come from buying good assets. I'm going to repeat what I just said. Success in investing does not come from buying good assets. Rather, it comes from buying things or buying assets well. Let me explain what I mean by that. A good investment, or rather a good asset, can turn out to be a bad investment. A poor or an average asset or opportunity can turn out to be a great investment. One of the misconceptions that we have, or that the marketplace has, is the belief that success comes from buying good assets. Good real estate buildings, good companies. Unfortunately, that is wrong. And here's the reason. Without understanding the relationship between price and value, you leave yourself in a position where you might experience regret. At a certain price, an investment is considered to be shrewd. At another price, it's considered to be speculative and borderline silly. You could choose any company. We can use the company in the US or in the UK that is considered the highest market cap, or the company that is most valued. If you buy that company or buy a stock in that company at the market price, you may have bought a stock in a good or great company. But it doesn't mean that your investment was shrewd. It does not mean that your investment was good. And the reason is simple. You may have overpaid. And therefore, if for whatever reason the price or the market capitalization of the company goes down, then automatically you've lost capital. Remember what I've always said, that the most important responsibility you have as an investor is preservation of capital. So the price you pay is the most important decision you can make. You can buy average assets, but if you buy them at a discount or at a very affordable, cheap price, there is an opportunity for you to make money. Unfortunately, if you overpay for an asset, then you have to rely on the hope that the value of the company or the asset will at some point move up to meet the price. Now, this is a good time for me to explain that there is a relationship between price and value. That relationship is unique. Price often will move up to meet value, or price will move down to meet value. However, they do not always converge. The convergence requires time. So for example, you find a great asset that is underpriced and you pay for it. You've exercised your faith. You're buying an asset and you're relying on hope. You're relying on hope and you're relying on time. And your hope is that at some point, the market will recognize that the value is much higher, and therefore the marketplace will reprice the asset. In other words, that price will move up to meet value. But it's based on hope. But it never has to occur. There are some assets or companies or investments where the value is somewhere there and the price is somewhere there. But it never moves up to meet the value. In other words, let's use a company, for example. You find a company, let's say it's an average company, it's not a great company, and you've identified the intrinsic value, and your identification says it's worth £100, but it's selling for £20. You buy the asset, with the hope and with faith that over time the price will move up to meet the value and then you can make a profit. However, if you haven't studied the company in detail, if you haven't looked at the capital structure, if you haven't analyzed to see what the balance sheet says, if you haven't looked at the income statement or the statement of cash flow, if you haven't done your thorough analysis, you may have missed out on a very simple, evident um, position, which is that maybe the company is really in a bad place financially. And this company might stay there in terms of its price, or it might even go bankrupt for whatever reason. Maybe it owes money to its creditors and it cannot fulfill its obligations, and therefore the creditors foreclose or take over the company. The company goes into bankruptcy, and therefore you, as the equity investor, lose everything. So the key thing to remember is this: success in investment comes not from buying good assets, but from buying things well. In order for you to buy things well, 3 criteria must be met. Number 1, you must understand the terms of engagement, meaning understand the terms of the deal, whether it's real estate, whether it's a company. Number 2, you must have a very clear understanding of the value of the business, the asset, or the investment. Number 3, the price you pay. 3 simple questions, 3 simple recommendations. If you are unable to meet these 3 requests or expectations or prerequisites, one of the things you should do is take a step back. If you say, I don't understand the terms, I haven't identified the value, therefore I have failed to meet the first of the 2 requirements, then it doesn't matter what the price is, because you might be investing in what seems to be a good opportunity, but you may have overpaid. Let me make it more practical. I talked about a friend of mine some time ago, in one of the earlier sessions, who was looking to buy a house. And they had looked in a certain location and they had found different prices. And every time they would come to me, they would say, I found this. And my question was always, can I see the floor plan? Or can you tell me what the floor area is? The reason was simple. I was trying to understand from a pricing perspective whether from a relative valuation, in other words, comparing it to the average cost per square meter in that local area, whether the property was overpriced or underpriced. Now, we hadn't even looked at valuation, but one of the very simple ways of, I would say, evaluating opportunities, especially with properties, is simply look at the relative cost or the relative price. And this is where you compare one property against another property. And normally you have a matrix, and that matrix in some cases is simply the floor area. In some cases, with my friend, we were shocked to see that there were certain areas on the same street, or rather, there were certain streets in the same area where you would find a property going for, now, equal properties are all effectively within the same description. I'm not referring to different types of buildings. I'm talking about the same specification. Some properties were being sold at £12,000 per square meter. Some were being sold for 7,500. And occasionally there was ones where we found a property being sold for 6,200 or 6,150 per square meter. Now, I'm not suggesting that because it was cheap, that it was a good deal. All I'm saying is price matters. price matters. And don't be fooled by the packaging. Don't be fooled by the fact that it's Apple or Microsoft. The question you should ask yourself is, what is the value? And how does the value compare to the price? Now, when you've established the value, the intrinsic value, the next thing and the next step is to allow in your calculations for something called the margin for error or the margin of safety. The margin of safety is a provision. In engineering, back in the day, whenever we designed a building or designed a system in a building, you always made allowances for the different possibilities of how the building will be used. So you may have designed a hotel, or I may have designed a hotel, and if you hadn't or did not consider that there was a possibility that a particular section of the building may have been changed, or the use of that space may change, whereby you have what would have been a bedroom, and you design a bedroom to accommodate two people. The structural loading is designed to accommodate two people. The engineering services are designed to accommodate two people. However, there are occasions where you might have the rooms, maybe 4 rooms next to each other. And if in the future the owner decides that we can make more money by combining all 4 rooms into a conference or a meeting room, or if we can convert the space into a different use, we could make more money. So occasionally you might have a case where the building owner or the hotel operator might change the use of a space. If you have it as a meeting room, then you have to allow for more density of people. So what may have been an allowance of, say, in a bedroom, you design for roughly 10 meters square per person in your design. In a meeting room or in a conference room, you have to make an allowance for maybe 4 meters square per person. So automatically, you've almost doubled the number of people that would use the space. And that means that all of the services, all of the infrastructure needs to be upgraded. Therefore, if that hadn't been allowed for in your very early design, the cost to the owner to renovate or retrofit and accommodate all those changes would be very high. So one of the things we always did was we allowed for what we call margin for changes, or we allowed for what we call redundancy. We allowed for tolerances to accommodate engineering, number one, engineering errors, installation errors, operational changes, and most importantly, the change of use of the building or the space. And that meant by making provision for a certain percentage, could be 20%, you've done your load calculation, your structural load calculations, and you say, well, let's make an allowance for an extra 20% or for an extra 15%. By making the provision for that extra margin, you protect you, the designer, but you also protect the operator, and you save them money. The same concept applies with investing. Remember, when you're investing, you're making a decision about a future event or about a future that you do not have certainty about. You may have made an informed decision, but the future is unknown. And so it's important never to be too confident in your valuation. It's an estimate. There's so many factors, there's so many scenarios that could occur. I wish I had something to perhaps explain this principle. I'd like you to think of a jar, a cookie jar. Now I take that cookie jar and I empty the cookie jar. And I take different colors of stones, yellow, red, blue, green, pink, white, black, and I fill that cookie jar with all those stones. I shake it and I present it to you. That cookie jar represents the future. There are so many stones of different colors. If I asked you to close your eyes and pick a stone, and you did, and you opened your eyes and you looked at the stone, you would know what you picked. If I asked you to close your eyes again and repeat the exercise, but this time around I said, before you pick the stone, I want you to tell me what color of stone you would pick. And then I asked you to proceed and pick a stone. The prediction you made was your estimate. When you've picked the stone, that is the actuality, that's the actual result. It's very difficult for, in many cases, your prediction or your estimation and the actual to be the same. In the same way, the future is unknown. You estimate what the value of an asset could be, but you make allowances for errors. Errors in your calculation, errors in your decision making, errors in your judgment. So for example, we find an asset that is selling at a price of £100. You've estimated the value to be 150. Is 150, the price is 100. Automatically, you could say that is selling or is trading at a discount to its value. You shouldn't be too quick to make a move. And here's the reason. You could be wrong. Your calculation could be wrong. So first thing we say, you've established the value, you have an idea about what the price is. It's time to allow for your margin for error or your margin of safety. Now think about this scenario. Both of us are driving in a car. We drive down from a part of central London and we're driving across Thames Water, River Thames in London. The Thames River is quite a distance in terms of height from the bridge. And let's assume we're going across London Bridge and we're driving. But what if just before we drove over, we saw a very, very clear sign that says this bridge is undergoing maintenance. And this bridge can only accommodate a car with a weight of 10 tons. Just let's use the example as 10 tons. And if the car we were driving and both of us in the car weigh in total 8.5 tons, according to the specification of the car, the question is, would you drive across the bridge knowing by your several meters, maybe a few hundred meters into the water, would you cross the bridge? The answer would be no. It can only take 10, you weigh 8, there is no margin for error. You would simply, or I hope, as a matter of fact, I would probably advise that you did that, turn around and drive to another bridge, maybe go down Chelsea Bridge. Who knows? We might get down to Chelsea Bridge and it says, oh, this bridge is fine and it can accommodate up to 50 tons. Therefore, 8, 50, you have a lot of margin. Now here is the point. On the other hand, if we were driving across my driveway, and let's say I'm making some renovations to my driveway and we've put a temporary overhang to allow the car to come out from the garage before we leave and join the street. And if that overhang is only this much above the driveway, and if because of this very little distance, so little, I said to you, would you be able to move over this temporary bridge we've constructed, taking into account that the overhang can only take 10 tons and the car weighs 8 tons? Would you go across? The answer is probably yes. Here's the difference. The risk of loss of life is very low on the driveway because of how little you have to fall. However, across the bridge, the risk of loss of life is much higher. So the margin of safety you apply is not a fixed number. You have to adjust it. If you analyze a company, use Apple for example. If you're not a technology analyst and you're not very familiar with technology and the industry and the markets and the consumers' desires and preferences, and therefore you can't predict where the company will be in 10 years, then you should allow for a much bigger margin of safety. Because whilst you might be able to estimate the intrinsic value of Apple, there's a lot more uncertainty, there are a lot more qualitative measures that you can't account for. So you must allow for maybe a much higher margin of safety. On the other hand, if you were like a technology expert and you've studied the industry for so many years, you understand the industry very well, it's possible that you might decide that you do not need a very large margin of safety, and therefore you might be willing to go for something much less. The point is that certain assets, based on the investor's experience, ability, knowledge, based on his analysis of risk and uncertainty, based on his qualitative and quantitative research, there are certain assets where you need a smaller margin of safety. And there are certain assets where you need a much bigger margin of safety. Apple, for example, has a few hundred billion in cash. It's cash flow rich. Therefore, you don't need as much of a margin of safety with Apple because you know they have a lot of cash. So even if they run into a 2-year problem of liquidity, you know that they have cash. If you were to look at another company that is probably not as successful as Apple, and they only have, say, £700,000 in cash, and assuming that they need possibly 300 every single year, then they have 700. They need 300 just in operational expenses. Perhaps if you allow for cost of goods sold and SG&A, which simply means sales, general, administration cost, maybe that 300 goes up to 650, then the margin for error is not enough. So the point I'm trying to make, and I'm sorry I've used this very long-winded explanation, is to say this. When you've identified the value of something, always make provision for a margin of safety, a margin for error. So the price of the asset is 100, the value is 150, great. You might decide, okay, I'm going to allow for a 50% margin for error, which means that 50% of 150 is 75. So 75 pounds is the maximum that you would be willing to pay for the asset. Therefore, although the price is 100 and the value is 150, you have to stick to 75. There's a risk. The risk in choosing very large margins for error or safety is that there will be so many opportunities you miss out on. Therefore, you have to be very, 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 I would say, discerning and careful about not pricing yourself out of the market. For example, in real estate, you find a property, you like it, it meets all of your requirements, you make a 15% an offer to the client or the seller, but you deduct 15% of the asking price. Now, you have to be careful because if it's a great deal, and if you've identified that the value is much higher, someone else may also see that the value is much higher. They might be willing to only ask for 5% discount, which would mean you lose the opportunity. So it's a case of balancing and understanding what's important, when the margin of safety should be large and when it should be small. Now let me conclude. I started this session and I said that success in investing could not be attributed to buying good assets. That success was simply based on buying things well. And in order for you to buy things well, the price you pay is what matters. The higher the discount from the intrinsic value, the better the investment. So you can buy average assets, but if you underpay and the price moves up to meet the value, you do well. But if you buy a great investment, a great asset, but you overpay because you've overpaid, unfortunately, you could have made a loss from simply overpaying if the value does not move up to meet the price that you paid. Very important. So, in conclusion, I'll say this. Always ask yourself, what are the three things that I need to satisfy the three criterias, the three prerequisites or prerequisites that I need to satisfy? What are the terms? In real estate, it's not just the purchase cost or the capital cost, it's the financing, it's the management requirements or operational requirements, it's understanding whether there are any legal costs. Those are terms. Secondly, what is the value? That you have to calculate yourself. And number three, what is the price? And what price must I pay? Now recognize something, that the market price and the price you pay are not synonymous. The market defines the price it wants. You must define the price you're willing to pay. So I'd like to leave you with perhaps an exercise. I'd like you to perhaps do something. Look down whatever street you live in. Identify a property on the market that is for sale. Spend some time and see if you can analyze and understand what the terms of the transaction would be if you were to proceed with the purchase. Next, I want you to identify what you believe the intrinsic value of the asset is. Then I want you to identify what the market price is, and then I want you to identify the price you're willing to pay. In the price you're willing to pay, you would have to also identify your margin for error or your margin of safety. Get a sheet of paper, make a list, do your calculations, and then once you've completed it, I'd like you to come up with a conclusion. Would I buy this asset knowing what I know? If the answer is yes, on one page of the piece of paper, I'd like you to write down at least 10 reasons why you would proceed. Whether you have decided that you will proceed or not, in this case, if it's a property or an assessment that where you have come to the conclusion that you would not proceed, I would like you also, on the other piece of paper, the other page, identify 10 reasons why you would not. And here's the point. Investing is an intellectual game. I'm not sure if you've been in a debate team. I don't know how people are taught today or in these days. But if you go back to my, I was going to say my generation, but that makes me sound quite old, which I'm not. But if you go back to my age group, and if you look at how we were trained about debating, whenever there was a debate, if you were in a debate team, your debate coach would identify a topic. You were told what the topic would be, the topic you'd be debating. But he or she never told you, I don't know if this happened with your teacher, but the way it should have been done is that the debate coach never told you whether you would be debating for or whether you would be debating against the topic. And that meant you had to prepare. You had to study the topic in detail so that you could argue both sides. And therefore, it made you more rounded. It made you less emotional. You had to put your biases to one side. As a matter of fact, you had no biases and priors. You were not prejudging because you didn't know what side you would be arguing on. The day of the debate, in some cases, a few minutes before you were brought on stage, you were told what camp you would have to go and support. And what that did is it gave us, and it gave those who were participants, the ability to be rational when we do preparations. You came to the subject with no preconceived ideas. You had no biases, you had no priors, and that meant you were objective. In the same way, I've asked you to do the analysis of looking at the reasons you would invest, but also the reasons you would not invest, to enable you apply the thinking process that is needed as an investor. Most people are very emotional when it comes to making investment decisions. If you ask some people, why did you buy Apple stock? They might say, because it's a great company. Or they might say, because my brother recommended it. Or they might say, because I heard so-and-so investor has just bought it. Those are all emotional decisions. They're not rationally calculated, and therefore you run a risk of putting your capital, your principal, at risk. The idea of taking a step back and saying investing is an intellectual game. It's a game where it should be based on facts first. It should be based on reasoning first and not emotion. By going through this exercise and homework I've just given you, I think and I believe that it will allow you, first of all, to crystallize what we've learned and what we've shared today, but most importantly, it will start positioning you in such a way that you can start thinking